Britain Growing. My name is Daniel. I am a researcher at the Centre for Policy Studies looking at fiscal and economic matters. So the big question is about getting Britain growing. Obviously we all know some of the stats that, if Britain had grown from 2010 as it had in the previous 30 or 40 years, every family would be hundreds of pounds better off each week. So the Labour government has staked a lot of its reputation around fixing this problem, and with me to discuss whether they'll be successful and the Conservative answer to that is a fantastic panel. So we've got Gareth Davies, who's an MP and Shadow Exchequer Secretary, Ranil Jayawardena, who is former Cabinet Minister, Kate Andrews from The Spectator, and Jared Lyons, who is a CPS Fellow. And just to give you a sense of how it works, we're going to go through and just hear some remarks from each speaker. I'll ask a few follow-up questions, and then we will open it up for questions from the floor, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. So Gareth, do you want to start first?
Well, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be at a CPS event. Let me start by giving some context, and I know this would perhaps be expected of me to do that, but I think it is important to outline the fact that we've had essentially 3 global economic shocks over the last 15 years, and 2 have happened in just the last parliament. The global pandemic and the war in Ukraine both had an impact, obviously, on levels of debt, but obviously has also had an impact on growth. But despite that, we shouldn't allow a narrative to get away from us that things are all terrible. We have half the deficit that we had in 2010, near record lows of unemployment, inflation back to near 2% target. So the fundamentals of the economy are actually a lot better than perhaps the narrative at the moment suggests. But there were 2 big challenges and 2 levers that we were really focused on when we were in government, and these are pervasive issues for our country when it comes to growth and productivity, and they are workforce participation and business investment. If I just take both of those just very briefly. Workforce participation, by that we mean families re-entering the workplace after having children, and that's why we implemented a series of reforms on childcare. Whether that is the long-term sick, where we have a particular challenge in this country, and particularly for the disabled who wish to enter the workforce but are precluded from doing so for a variety of reasons, and youth unemployment, which I think at the last count stands at about 13.3%. So workforce participation as a lever in public policy, I think, could make a significant difference, and that's why if you look back to the last 3 fiscal events that we led, we focused on trying to tackle that. And then secondly, on business investment, it is an underappreciated fact that actually on foreign direct investment, FDI, we do pretty well. We're 3rd in the world. At one point we were 2nd, behind the United States and China. And that is because of the things that sometimes we take for granted. Things like our amazing education institutions, our language, our time zone, our common law, and stability of our regulatory regime, as well as our tax regime. And so those are the fundamentals that have enabled us to attract investment, and you're starting to see that continue under the Labour government, whether it's the Blackstone investment or Amazon, which we started last year in discussions with them. But if you can tackle workforce participation and stimulate as much business investment as possible, you can grow the economy. And that's why the measures that we implemented in government were scored pretty well by the OBR to bear fruit. And I think you're going to start to see that come through. Question for the Labour government, I'll end on this, is they talk about growth, but what is their plan to do it? And Jeremy Hunt set out in an article recently 3 tests. What are they doing about employment? What are they doing about investment? And what are they doing in terms of stability and certainty? Because at the moment there's a lot of uncertainty about the fiscal rules. That doesn't provide the certainty that they promised. So that's what we're looking for in the budget to come.
Great, thank you. Ranil, over to you.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the invite. It's great to be with the CPS once again, a think tank that's always been in the common ground of our politics and our party, and great to follow Gareth as well, who is a great talent in our parliamentary party, who I know will have a lot to give as we rebuild in the next few years. I'd like to drop down from that strategic level to the life for people on the ground, because from the 18th century to the early 20th century, Britain was a real world leader in building infrastructure. We built the first major railways, the canals, and we pioneered underground transit as well. But today, projects that should take just years are taking decades. Take the Lower Thames crossing. It's cost £300 million for just pieces of paper, and not a single shovel has been put in the ground. Every British tram network costs more per mile than any single French equivalent, with the most expensive British system costing 8 times as much as the cheapest French one. And while France has built 3 times as much motorway as us since 1986, we remain stuck in neutral. The last motorway that we built was in 2003, the M6 toll. So fundamentally, my contention is that Britain builds far too little infrastructure, which impedes our economic growth, and what we build is far too expensive and takes far too long. And we need to build the right stuff. Road improvements between 1998 and 2007 generated £1 billion in job creation from 1.8 billion of public investment, highlighting a significant impact as a result of that stimulus. And sure, rail investments can deliver substantial economic benefits too, but the IFS, the exalted body that we should all listen to, I'm sure, have compared the two, and they are clear. Road improvements provide far more bang for buck in terms of job creation and in terms of local development. But successive transport secretaries, and I think we've got to be honest about this, Conservative and Labour have prioritised rail nonetheless. It's almost, it seems to me, that policy is made by people in London, for people in London, rather than for everyone else around the country outside of the M25. So as a party, I think we should be using this opportunity to start again. And our policy should be very, very simple. Build more roads. And whilst young people want to live in our biggest towns and cities, they simply aren't dense enough to accommodate them. Inner London, for example, has a population density of just 25,000 people per square mile, which is less than half of central Paris. And that's the start of a spiral. Low density forces many young people into shared housing or long-term renting, and they delay big decisions like starting a family. Families have fewer children than they would like. Parents go back to work earlier than they would like. And the biggest reason for all of that is that housing in our cities is scarcer and more expensive than it should be. So as well as infrastructure, if we want to get Britain growing, we need to make our cities denser and more affordable for the next generation to live in, work and start a family. And the third point is that, and this is a hard truth for our country, we can't afford the future public services and our welfare system without more younger people working to pay for it. And reporting on my past comments on this, the quality newspaper, the Metro, said that we need to get bonking for Britain. And that Britain's ageing population and declining birth rate could be solved only by spending more hours in the bedroom. Well, these are challenges we must rise to. So those are challenges that I think we'd all agree we must pursue to secure growth that is sustainable and contributes to better outcomes for our young people, who are the future of our country and of this party. It's not just about building more roads and building railways and building homes. It's about making sure that there's a future for young people to thrive in. None of these reforms is unattainable. Most don't even require primary legislation. So what we need as a party is focus, energy and political willpower to make it happen. And if we act now, we can be the party that sets out the direction of travel. We can be the party that takes back the mantle of growth and transforms Britain into the most affluent countries once again, and securing the prosperity of generations to come.
That's great. Kate.
Thank you, and thank you to the CPS for having me. I've been thinking recently about the spectacular disconnect that is happening at the heart of public policy and the public finances, really, in the UK. And that's the fact that taxing and spending are at record levels, but no one, if you told them that, would really believe you. So you have a state that is taxing more and spending more than it has done in decades. And yet, if you're sending your child to school, there's a chance that the roof is falling in. You or perhaps a family member are waiting months on end for a routine procedure on the NHS. Your local bus route has been canceled. Your train connection is always delayed. You feel like you have very little, and yet the numbers tell us that tax and spend is absolutely off the charts, brought higher by contested Tory governments. And part of the problem, this is, I think, a part of a big reason that it's so hard to fix the public sector. It's so hard to tackle the public sector and make the reforms that might make some of these most expensive things sustainable, like the state pension, like the NHS, is that it's actually quite a terrifying prospect to say to people who are feeling poor, who've been through an inflation crisis, but even before that, were feeling poor, real wages were stagnant for over a decade. For people who already feel like they're struggling to access the health service, it's really hard to say to them, what we're going to do is we're going to move to a social health insurance model, which will ensure sustainability for the future, but we're going to ask you to pay £30 every time you can go to the doctor if you're over a certain income level, if you can afford it. That's a terrifying prospect when you already feel like you don't have the disposable income. So you feel like you can't afford it, and that makes any kind of serious talk of reform completely off the cards. It takes it completely off the cards. And it's also a vicious cycle because every political party will talk about capital investment when they get into power. The Tories did it. You saw it with George Osborne and David Cameron. They picked some really bad projects like HS2, but at least they were talking about capital spend. Now we're seeing with the Labour Party, we need that long-term investment. I'm going to be fascinated to see what happens, but because there's this demand just to keep the lights on in these big public services, all the money gets funneled into day-to-day spending. That's what voters indicate they want, and there's no capital spend. I mean, if the Tory party had just put a fraction of the money that they put into HS2 into improving local transport in 2010, those projects would have been online for the 2024 election. But it was short-termism, and it happens to, it's not any particular critique of any particular government because they're all guilty. So you have this vicious cycle going on, and then when there is attempt at even very minor reform, you've got politics. You've got politics. And look at what just happened with the winter fuel payment. You had the Shadow Chancellor this morning saying that it is now impossible for a Labour government to tackle welfare. And to Gareth's point, it's so vital that it does. We have 5.6 million people on out-of-work benefits now. No doubt a lot of people need that support, but this number has skyrocketed since the pandemic. We have a lot of people out of work who would be better off for their mental health if they were in work. And he's saying, well, because of the winter fuel payments, it's now impossible for Labour to do anything because they've scuppered it so much. But why was it scuppered? It was ultimately scuppered because the Tory party, which, behind closed doors has been talking for 15 years about getting rid of payments like that, or at least changing them, means testing them, saw a political opportunity, and couldn't even get behind £1.5 billion worth of spending cuts. You can argue that it was a crass way to do it. You can argue that it should have gone hand in hand with pensions reform. I probably won't buy it, seeing as the Tories were promising to protect the triple lock on state pensions in their own manifesto. This is pure politics. It makes it really difficult to get anything done. And to me, if we are in this now very difficult position where people feel worse off, change is near impossible, and politics is always going to get in the way, the only answer really is growth. The only answer really for people to start opening up their minds to change, for people to start opening up their minds to reform that could make some of this stuff sustainable, is to grow the economy, because GDP is not a number on a spreadsheet. It is higher wages. It is more job opportunity. It is better income. It's being able to upgrade to that larger house for your family, or to indeed get on the housing ladder once we build some homes, to Randall's point. The idea that perhaps you've put all of your money that you scraped together into your house and you don't want more homes being built. You're worried about the value of your home. And that idea becomes less powerful, so it starts to go away a little bit if you're feeling better off overall. And the UK has just been in this stagnant place where if you're lucky, we're talking about just over 1% growth a year. That is nothing to write home about. That is not impressive. And I think the growth, it's going to be really tricky because a lot of what needs to change is what will enable more economic growth, back to that vicious cycle. But people need to see early indication that if you do start doing those supply side reforms, you will be better off and you can be a little less afraid of the fundamental changes that have to take place. And I think the real question for Tory MPs and indeed the party is if Labour were to propose some of those pro-growth ideas, and I mean really propose good ideas. We don't know what they're going to do on the NHS yet. We don't really know what they're going to do on housing yet. The early plans don't look like they're actually going to have the results in the revolution we're looking for. But if they did propose those plans, is the Tory party ready to back it? Because more economic growth, showing people that this can be a more prosperous nation, would allow for some of those very important free market ideas in the Tory party to get more of a listen, for people to open up their minds a bit more to that kind of change when they feel a bit more secure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. Well, my comments follow on from my three colleagues here quite easily. I like to focus on three areas: debt, global perspective, and then bringing it back to what we need to do here in the UK. In terms of debt, it follows naturally on from what Gareth opened up about, with the budget imminent. We have to recognise financial markets are going through an evolution from a focus on inflation for the last few years to a focus on growth currently, but debt will be their next focus in 12, 18 months' time. And 6 of the 7 G7 countries, including Britain, are in danger of falling into a debt trap. Debt trap is when your debt exceeds 100% of GDP, when your rate of growth is less than the interest you pay in your debt. And in that situation, you basically have to run a primary surplus to stand still. And the last time we ran a primary surplus, which is spending minus revenue, take out interest payments, was back in 2001. So effectively, when your debt's over 100% of GDP and your rate of growth is low, you face a real difficult situation. And we have 5 options, really. You can have more than one at the same time. You grow the economy, as Kate touched on. You reform. You have austerity. Didn't really work last time. You tax. Can't really keep doing that. Or you borrow, but we're up to our borrowing limit. So it really does come down to growth. But before 2008, this economy doubled in size in real terms, take out inflation, every 26 years or so. It probably doubles in size in real terms now somewhere between 50 to 60 years. And effectively, you could say we're poorer than we were, but expectations haven't really changed. Now, the Chancellor is going to not tweak the fiscal rules, it seems, according to the media, but she's going to try and redefine debt to include public sector assets. Now, in time, that might allow you to target your spending better. But at the end of the day, deficits have to be funded, debts have to be paid, international investors have to be kept on side, and the markets need to have confidence that you're going to keep your fiscal numbers under control. And we face a real difficult challenge on the debt front unless we start to see much stronger, sustained economic growth. That leads on to the second point, the global picture. We have to be mindful of how the world economy is significantly changing. 15 to 20 years ago, when the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and others did their 5-year ahead projections, they were talking about the global economy growing somewhere between 4.5% to 5% over the next few years, each year on average. Back in those days, 15, 20 years ago, if the world economy was growing anywhere close to 3%, it was called a global recession. The world economy now, according to the IMF, is expected to grow just at 3.2 to 3.3% in coming years. Rates of growth that in the past we would have been very disappointed by. But it's not only the slow rate of global growth, it's where that growth's coming from. The Indo-Pacific, you need to basically turn your map of the world around, look at India in the west, America in the east, and that's where the growth regions of the world is. That, the other side of the planet. And we need to reposition ourselves in that global picture. But it's challenging. Globalization was a dominant theme in the last 25 years, helping to keep inflation under control. It wasn't just central banks. Globalization is being replaced by fragmentation because of the changing geopolitical environment. That means global inflation might result in UK inflation settling nearer 3% rather than the 2% UK target. It also means that we need to actually be mindful that national security decisions are now becoming very intertwined with economic policy making decisions, particularly in America, particularly on the continent, and also in key parts of Asia. UK industry has to overcome subsidies in other countries. We have basically higher hurdles to overcome if we're selling into other markets. We've got to compete in a very different global climate now to in the past. And it does mean competition is key. And that comes on to the next part, the third part, which is basically, I think, this conference, not just now, but in coming years, needs to fundamentally revisit Conservative Party economic thinking. The whole economic debate has moved away from the Conservative Party, despite, as it's been touched on, the successes of recent years in some areas. It's a left of centre debate. What does it mean? I tend to think one needs to look at it as three key pillars need to be addressed. One is fiscal policy, but that's not just about low tax rates. Tax simplification is as important as low tax rates. And it can't just be about tax cuts, as important as they are. Monetary policy and the city are another key part of this. So one pillar is fiscal policy, another pillar is monetary policy. But politicians, despite being up to speed with the economic debate, across Westminster rarely seem to talk about monetary policy. It seems to be seen to be outside of their remit. Yet the most important issue on the doorstep this summer was the cost of living crisis. Monetary policy is a fundamental area where the bank needs to be held to account. And then the third pillar is about the supply side. Now, Ranil correctly talked about public investment, but it's not just about the public, it's also about private investment. We need to incentivise the private sector to invest. We need to ensure that the city starts to close those funding gaps that have existed for years, if not decades. And the supply side is about all the I's. It's about investment, innovation, infrastructure, and incentives, both in terms of the tax side and in terms of the regulatory side. And that covers a whole host of other areas we'll probably talk about in the Q&A. But basically, we need to be mindful of the current debt position. We need to be mindful and conscious of the changing global picture. And I think we need to start to revisit the framework of domestic policy here. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. That really covered a lot more than I thought it would. So thank you so much. I think one of the sort of big, I guess it's almost like a paradox that has been touched on, is that on one hand, we've run out of, government is too big to expand any further. And at the same time, it's not working very well. And at the same time, we somehow need to start making these reforms to get economic growth. But there's no slack in the system that we can do. And Kate, you touched on kind of the fact that you have to convince people by showing them there's growth, but we almost can't make some of these changes to growth without hurting them in the first place, and it's sort of a vicious cycle. So I guess I'm interested in what's the answer, what's the first things that the Conservative Party would do? How would it begin that journey? What reforms would it start with? And I guess politically, how would you convince people of that? To sort of suffer short-term pain, more short-term pain to get those long-term goals?
Well, if I may, no disrespect, but we've just had 15 years to answer the question, right? No offense to the politicians on the panel at all, but when you say, where would the Tory party start, I think the very difficult reality that must be woken up to is that the answer is pretty much nowhere. They wouldn't start on housing. It was too politically difficult. They would not start on healthcare. That was way too politically difficult. They wouldn't start on energy, really. I know Liz Truss tried. She didn't have a long time to see how that would go for other reasons. I mean, the Tory party has had a lot of time to indicate where they would start their pro-growth reforms, and I'm not saying there were none, But towards the end especially, some of the justifications that were given, the idea that the state was now going to even more heavily subsidize childcare, which is not even a market, right? I mean, this is a completely broken model, that the state was going to shove billions of pounds more into it. That was described to me as a supply side reform. You know, it was, unless you're going to reform childcare, unless you're going to reform the NHS, shoving money into these black holes is not a supply side reform. I'm an optimist. I don't think that means that the Tory party can't find these areas and can't come around to the idea that, you know, and the CPS has done some great reporting on this, depending on how you speak to local communities, depending on how you frame the question, you really can convince people to build more infrastructure and to build more homes in their local community. But they didn't really try, especially towards the end. So what would they do is I think the question that has to be grappled with, and I'm sure the panel will have some great ideas, but that's the question that has to be grappled with, because 6 months ago they could have done it. They were in power, and they were in power 5 years before that, and 5 years before that, and 5 years before that. Not a lot was delivered on the supply side.
I'm sure some people want to respond.
Well, I mean, just picking up first the childcare point, I mean, I do have great sympathy with your point, Kate. If you actually ask people what they would like to do, the vast majority of primary carers of young children want to spend more time at home. They want to spend, ideally, the first 3 years at home full-time. They want to spend the first 5 years part-time. And they don't actually want so-called free childcare, which of course is taken from other people in taxes to pay for it. What they want is the tax system to be fairer. And I commend an excellent report from the Centre for Policy Studies, which talked about exactly this, because that is the sort of reform that actually delivers for working people, encourages people to do their very best in the workplace, but encourages also responsibility at home. And that's the sort of brave policy, I think, that we as a Conservative Party need to make, or certainly an argument that we need to make. And it comes back, I think, to the challenge around road versus rail, that for too long we have, in common with other parties, been a party that's been dominated by London-based policy at the expense of policy in the country as a whole. And the two have been majorly detached. On planning, I think, you know, fundamentally, again, there have been certain things that we've just seen as too difficult, and we've got to be brave enough again to tackle it. So when I, unsuccessfully I know, but knocked on doors earlier in the year and indeed in previous elections, no one's ever said to me they want their children to be able to afford to rent a house from the council forever. That's not what they mean by affordable housing. What they mean are homes their children can afford to buy. And yet, for the entire time that we've been in government, we've used the Labour lexicon of affordable housing, which means exactly what people don't want it to mean, which means that developers have to build developments that are economically driven to handing away 40% of the housing to a housing association or a council, which means the housing development isn't what it used to be, people don't get what they want, and no one therefore advocates for more homes. And then in terms of the legal system that underpins some of this stuff, there's something that I doubt anyone in this room would have heard of. I hadn't heard of it until I did some research on this. The Aarhus Convention. Has anyone heard of this? It's a convention that I think we should leave. You won't hear many people talking about that as the convention that we should leave this week. But it governs public participation in environmental decision making. So it allows small groups or individuals to be able to fight judicial reviews with almost no recourse, whereas public authorities and developers have to pay the full whack. And it leads to an asymmetry in the system that just stops anything being built anywhere. And those are the sorts of rules that we then need to get on and reform the next time we have the privilege of forming a government, because they are being interpreted in a very different way from the way that they are in other countries. We don't have to look too far, just like with the European Convention on Human Rights. Other countries interpret these things in a different way. We seem to gold-plate it. And those are the sorts of things that we need to redress to restore the balance that should exist if we want to get building again.
Great. Did you want to?
Yeah, I agree with the comments that have just been said, and although I'm not sure if I would agree with pulling out organisation I'm not yet sure about, but apart from that, I agree with the principles, I should say. But at the beginning of the year, the FT Financial Times has a survey of economists. It's always dangerous when economists agree on something. But in the survey at the beginning of the year, economists were asked, name one thing that they would do if they could be in charge of policy. I suggested two things, but one was instant planning reform, and more than half the economic respondents said that, which is basically concurring with your point, but the politics prevented it. The other change I argued for would be institutional reform. The Treasury is a super ministry, which in other countries, its powers would be divided amongst other departments. And it often is the case that the growth agenda comes secondary to the fiscal numbers, although as we can see from the fiscal numbers, they're not really under control in the way in which we would like them to be. But also, look, in any walk of life, the way you get on is doing your job properly and then having a clear vision for the future. The thing the Conservatives now need to do is do their job properly, which is hold the government to account. And as you said, when the government does things that are correct, then support them. But there's lots that suggest that they could be held to account in lots of other ways. But it leads on to the vision. I think it's necessary to have a clear vision about the future. And in that respect, coming on your point, is about changing the terms of the debate. Our term of reference needs to be with the Indo-Pacific, with the growing countries of the world. Indeed, the Shadow Chancellor, when he was Chancellor, pointed this out in terms of the countries that we need to compete with. Their public spending, their taxation is very different to Western Europe. So, but one needs to actually be really engaged in that debate. And I don't think the party has been as fully driving that agenda despite 14 years of being in power.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know where to begin. I think look, what I would say is when you actually meet with businesses and you meet with international investors, we can debate the individual policies, but what came up time and time again was that they want certainty of policy direction, stability of government, and the only thing that came close to granular policy was around planning.
Yeah.
It did feel like I had 99 problems and they were all about planning in the Treasury. And I think there are, for sure, things that we need to radically change when it comes to planning. And to an earlier point, how will we conduct ourselves in opposition? Well, we should oppose when we disagree and when we think it's going to damage the country. But where, to Kate's point, they are implementing things that perhaps we should have done, perhaps things that will grow the economy and will unlock that investment even further, we shouldn't oppose that and we should help them. If you think about some of the big policy changes and big successes over the last few decades, things like auto-enrolment, which has brought 10 million people into saving for a pension, that was a cross-party agreement to carry that forward. And actually, to be fair to them, they are carrying over some of the things that we started in government recently, including the pension reforms. And so we should work constructively on that. But as I said before, when you look at what are the levers that will stimulate growth in this country, and what are the big challenges that we have to face and tackle with granular policy, it's workforce participation. That is a major, major hindrance to our productivity, and it's stimulating far more business investment. And it isn't just about tax, it isn't just about planning, it's about the environment, it's about selling the country's value, not just its price. There'll always be a country that is a cheaper price for investors. It's about the package that you offer, the environment you offer, and the stability and certainty of policy. That's what they want.
I completely agree with that. Yeah. The trouble is Britain is such an imbalanced economy, and it's imbalanced in place in terms of people and productivity. In place, it's London versus the rest. It's coastal versus inland. It's urban versus rural. In terms of people, it's older versus younger. And with that, it's homeowners versus renters. And when it comes to productivity, it's skilled versus unskilled. And depending on you and where you sit, you can actually either be in an incredibly successful space, because we have some of the most productive companies globally, and at the same time you can be in the worst possible place. And it's addressing those issues head on. That's the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll open it up to the floor. for questions. Please keep them short and make sure that they are actually a question. Great. Just this gentleman here.
Thank you. There's a correlation between the cost of energy and productivity and growth. I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about what we can do, because we have very high energy prices in this country. We've been pursuing policies under our recent government that were not necessarily helping us with our energy self-sufficiency, and Labour has policies that I think will make it worse. What should we be doing?
I'm happy to get stuck in on this one. First of all, I've always been a big fan of nuclear, and if you look at a big difference between us and France, part of the reason their energy is so much cheaper is because they produce something like 70% of their energy from nuclear power, and it provides a stable baseload that is non-carbon emitting, meets therefore all of the requirements that everyone wants to see. And we've just not done anything on that. In fact, Nick Clegg was delighted to boast that he'd seen off nuclear power stations during the coalition, and in fairness, we have not really pushed forward with that since. Part of the way that we can do that quickly is through SMR, small modular reactors. I think that is a new it's a tried and tested technology, but it's a new application of a tried and tested technology that we need to get on with and fast. And also, if you look at some of the coming back to planning, and you're right, I mean, this is where everything comes back to planning. If you look at some of the interconnectors that we could have with not only the Aquin interconnector to France, but the X-Links interconnector to Morocco, these are being held up in the planning system. And we could very easily and quickly produce or secure another 10 to 15% of our energy requirements by enabling these private sector projects. So I think there are a number of quick things to do. SMR is one, interconnectors is another, and the third is the licenses in the North Sea. I mean, I'm afraid that is a real act of economic vandalism from the Labour Party. It is going to be very detrimental to our energy security in the short and medium term. We're still going to require hydrocarbons. We're just going to be bringing them in from elsewhere, and that's less good for the environment and less good for our energy security. So I hope a future Conservative government will understand the realities of that and reverse it.
Yeah, well, given the science, I think we have to take the green agenda very seriously, but it's very difficult to move from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable economy overnight. I think it's the pace of transition that becomes so important. Clearly, there's been a big problem that we missed the opportunity with nuclear. David Howe, now in the Lords, has probably beaten the drum on this more than anyone. And we've missed that opportunity. Moving to renewables makes sense, but at the same time, you need to be mindful of the fact that you are still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So it's about getting that balance right. When one looks at the four major economies of Western Europe, the four that are in the G7, Germany, France, Italy and the UK, what's remarkable is how well the previous government did in terms of the UK outstripping growth in Italy and no growth really in Germany, but outstripping Germany and Italy immensely in recent years. But yet France, despite all the problems in its economy, we're still on the par with France, which highlights the importance, as you touched on, of their cheap energy. And we have incredibly expensive energy, and that is a big problem for us. So it's about getting the balance right in this transition and being sensible.
I think it's disappointing that the Labour Party made that pledge that your bills would be lower by an average of £300, which they've now dropped. Yes. They're rolling back on. But the reason I think it's particularly disappointing is because they're not wrong to say that if we can build all of this new green energy infrastructure, that bills will go down. That is correct. But it's to promise it as an election pledge without having to do that bit in between when you actually get people on side and you actually build it and you actually get the programs online. And given the fact that their planning agenda, as I said, remains rather vague, they clearly can't continue to make this promise because bills this year, bills next year, and bills the year after are not going to be lower by an average of £300. So I think to missell the idea of what actually has to be done is a big mistake because there are trade-offs here. And I don't think the trade-off is that in every person's backyard, you have to have your own mini nuclear reactor. But there are picturesque villages up and down the UK, beautiful, beautiful places where people do not want a new pole going up. They do not want a couple wires running across the town square, and that you're not going to be able to get away from that. You don't have to destroy these places. You do not have to remove their character. You do not have to have ugly infrastructure, but you are going to have some modern technology. That is the trade-off, and we need to be a little bit more honest with people about what it's actually going to look like, what it's actually going to include. We need to get communities on board with this. They need to have a say. To just promise the reduction in bills is to skip over the hard bit. Because as you say, you have to take the science very seriously. For the sake of the planet and for the sake of the economy, this stuff needs to be built. Stuff needs to be built. But we're not really being honest with people about that process.
Can I just comment? I think we have been, as a country, quite successful in terms of energy development and diversification of energy sources, particularly on renewables and our decarbonisation efforts. But we've almost been victims of our own success when it comes to two major issues that are precluding further development, and that is the grid capacity and grid connection time. Mm-hmm. And when I came into the Treasury in April 23, one of the first briefings I had was that it takes on average 14 years for a project to connect to the grid. And even if everybody wanted, we could connect them to the grid, there isn't the capacity on the grid and the supply chain resources to actually facilitate that. And countries around the world are facing this. Just to give you an example, there are only 4 companies in the world that produce high voltage cables. And if you think the US, Canada, Germany, France, Britain are all trying to do this, trying to expand and diversify our energy sources, that's a major problem from, frankly, a national security standpoint. And so while we implemented some reforms in office to get that time down, we got it down to like 7 years. It's still 7 years, right? So we are partly victims of our own success, but I think one of the reasons now I can reflect on this is that there are too many projects. There was no spatial planning. There was no helicopter view as to where energy projects should go, where it is appropriate for them to go, and where, in some instances, like in Lincolnshire, where I represent, we've got a massive problem in terms of clustering of solar farms. It's just really annoying everybody locally, and actually isn't going to move the needle when it comes to energy security. So, on reflection, I think having a strategic overview of our landmass and figuring out exactly where things should go, which energy sources are actually going to move the needle, like nuclear and offshore wind, which are least disruptive but most impactful in terms of powering the country. That's where we need to focus. That's where we didn't do enough on it. I think we just had this big rush to try and decarbonise, set these targets and try and figure it out later. That is something I think that we, going forward, particularly given Labour's position on this, which is not practical, it's not going to achieve the things that they think it's going to achieve, we need to have a really grown-up conversation about where we can move the needle with the least impact and be most competitive. That's how we change it.
And just this person at the front. Glasses.
Yeah, so Dr. Lyons mentioned France and the way that they are actually getting quite sustained growth despite some systemic problems like a low retirement age and all of the other sort of industrial problems and unions, etc. But part of the reason that they have done a few things really well is their national attitude is quite very quick to sort of grumble about issues and actually demand a change in things, so that government has had to make over a long time the right decisions in the right way. So if there's new housing, they build GP surgery, etc. nearby. One of the problems we have in Britain is that everybody's quite sort of able to put up with stuff for 30, 40 years until it snaps. The IEA was formed 50 years ago when people had put up with their life getting a little bit worse for a while, and then it's only the national humiliation that happens in the late 70s that changes that. How does the panel think that we can actually sell these policies before we have to do it through some sort of national humiliation or strife?
That's a great question.
I have the pleasure each year of attending something called the Anglo-Franco Colloque. It's a bit left of centre, and it's 70 French people, 70 British people, and do not ever think that the French are positive about the future. They are so pessimistic. They think their economy, their political system's about to implode. And they might well be correct. But in terms of answering the second part of your question, the economic period is not exactly the same as the 70s, but in the 70s, it was only when the Conservatives were in opposition and Labour was in power 74 to 79 that the Conservatives, through the Centre for Policy Studies, Sir Keith Joseph, or then Keith Joseph, Margaret Thatcher, came up with economic ideas. Labour, of course, only came up with their alternative economic agenda after they'd been kicked out of power. 79 to 82, Michael Foot fought the 83 election on the longest suicide note in history. But they went through their radical thinking and they came to the view that people didn't vote for them because they had to go more to the left and not to the centre. It's only now that the Conservatives are out of power that I think the Conservatives can come up with those sorts of views that are needed to answer your question. And quite frankly, I think the biggest criticism is the lack of communication, because when you listen to Gareth and others, there are so many success stories. In the general election, for instance, education, for instance, was never mentioned. I saw Nick Gibb the other week, the education minister. He should be carried around on a sort of up in the air for success. But you've touched on many key areas even today. So I think we shouldn't kill ourselves. The economy has major problems, but it's learning the lessons. But my view would be that now is the opportunity to have a radical rethink, because the economic debate, if you look at it, is very much more state, more taxation, more government spending. Industrial policies are now coming to the fore, where even the International Monetary Fund earlier this year said these are basically expensive, unsuccessful and protectionist. But that's the narrative that everyone's buying into. So I think this is a great opportunity to push back and start to rethink, is my view. I think we should be positive.
To what extent are we now damaged because we had a very short-term Prime Minister that did propose a lot of these sorts of things and did it very badly?
I'm not going to. There's others who. Last time I saw Liz Truss was the day she became Prime Minister. I saw her twice in the 2 weeks before she became Prime Minister. And I think I think her mini budget was the last straw that broke the camel's back. But there are lots of other issues at that time in terms of the Bank of England that were issues to learn. But in answer to your question, you need to be mindful of the market, you need to be mindful of what you're trying to do, and it's not just about tax cuts. You need to have a sensible economic policy, quite frankly. There's the pro-growth agenda, though, was quite sensible, as you were saying earlier at that time. But in answer, is the party damaged goods because of 2 years ago? Well, there's two people here who were in the last government. They probably should answer that question.
I mean, I feel like you should go.
Look, clearly, Liz has herself said she made mistakes, and I think everyone would probably agree with that in this room. The challenge was not accepting the spending reductions, for example, that were proposed by some. The challenge was not going first on the growth agenda and later revisiting the tax agenda. Absolutely, those are challenges. But I think what we're going to see, to Gerard's point actually, is that things are going to get materially worse under Labour, and so there is the opportunity for us to rebuild ourselves as a new coherent political machine with a clear tax policy for the future. You know, if they hike up CGT, if they hike up inheritance tax, if they hike up fuel duty, all sorts of different groups of people across this country will be affected. And so it does give us an opportunity to say, well, what do we think the state should look like? What do we think it should look like from a spending perspective, from afresh, from outside, but also what do we think it should look like from a tax perspective as well? And it is, clearly we both wanted the Conservative Party to win the general election. It looked very unlikely that that was going to be the case. But it is easier to do this from outside than it is from within. So, we must take the opportunity we've been given. It's not the opportunity we wanted, but we must take the opportunity we've been given and make it count.
Can I just say, well, no, I'm a glass kind of half full kind of person, but you can't, and it would be wrong of me to just consistently list all the good things that we left behind and all the good things we did, or even the good things that we tried. It is important that we reflect at this point on, why we lost the sport millions of people, why we, we didn't bring people with us, quite frankly. And I think there is a time and a place to go into individual policies. What people want is they want to know what a Conservative government would do no matter what the situation in the country or in the world, because it's founded in clear principles and values that they then can apply to whatever policy it is. And by that I mean, you just need, as Jared was saying, a clear, clean and consistent way of approaching government. And if I was being really critical of ourselves over the last 14 years, partly because we have so many prime ministers, leaders, chancellors, and who everybody comes in and they want to change it and do something different, or what, it's a patchwork of policies that are sometimes too short term, sometimes too reactive, and sometimes, dare I say it, trying to play to what the polling shows. And without a mind to actually what you believe in, fundamental to how public policy should be constructed. If you can just boil it down, it sounds so simplistic, this, but I really believe that if we had a leader or a shadow government who can communicate to the population the basic principles of how we will govern, the values that drive us, we almost don't need to get into the weeds on individual policies, because they will know that whatever the circumstances in the world, whatever the circumstances in the country, a Conservative government will likely do this or that.
Just to follow on from that, I think that's why the tax burden has been such a difficulty for the party, that people really thought that when they voted Conservative, when they supported a Tory government, that regardless of the situation, the tax burden wouldn't be rising, at least not as significantly as it did. And then it comes to your question, sir, about what kind of crisis do you have to have? And I had a former minister say to me not long ago about Labour and the expected tax rises to come. They're about to learn the hard way that if you hike tax, you get blamed. We, the Tory party, they were saying, had the best reason in a century, and it was a global pandemic, and we still got blamed. It's kind of extraordinary that this one thing you never expect to happen did happen, but the Tory party did not respond the way that people expected. And, a lot of it in that sense is unlucky, but it's hard to explain to a public when previous governments have been cutting corporation tax and revenue has been rising, that you're all of a sudden going to hike corporation tax. And yes, full expensing is a fantastic policy, but this stuff is never fully explained or sold to a public. And so the question is, well, what other crisis do you need to actually change things? And I would say, if we look at the state of the NHS, I simply don't know. And I don't wish whatever crisis that is upon anybody, because if this is not a crisis, 1 in 7 or 8 people in England being on the wait list, then what is? And I think that concept kind of terrifies me. But to go back to the question on the panel, how to get growth going, and Liz Truss was brought up, her legacy, her positive legacy, is that she made growth a really important word. Her anti-growth coalition actually really hit hard for the people who were afraid to be a part of it. And that was when the Labour Party started talking so much about growth. And they continue to, as does the Tory party, as does practically every party. But of course, just saying the word does not get you the public policy, and it doesn't get you the results. Just like Liz Truss saying that her mini budget was very free market did not make it true, did not get the results. So they're going to have to do a lot more than just say the words, but at least we're talking about it.
Thank you. It'd be remiss of me not to say that if you want to learn more about the 74 to 79 period, we've got a great book outside for sale talking about that. £22. Just the gentleman at the back.
Hi. I was going to ask Gareth, and still am, about the workforce participation element of your solution. But I just wanted to say that I was partly responsible for nuclear policy under the coalition government, and that my first and only political speech to Lib Dem conference in 2010 actually got Chris Huhne to personally assure me at conference that there would be no public subsidy for new nuclear power. That was the beginning of my political journey. But here I am now, 14 years later. Gareth, I'm curious about this workforce participation element because, I mean, as we see, every time we go to the supermarket, that there's less and less workforce participation across, and that's across all sectors, you know, with the ongoing revolutions in automation, technology, AI. It seems to be an argument from a previous era.
Yeah.
So essentially, if you break down the problem of a lack, you know, suboptimal workforce participation, it is the long-term sickness issue, which, pardon the pun, you know, to diagnose that in this session, we could have an entire session on. But one of the reasons is, you know, fitness to work assessments by GPs has become such that there's a sort of risk aversion whereby people get signed off for a lot longer than perhaps they should be signed off, sometimes indefinitely, in some cases when it comes to mental health. But as I was saying as well, you know, one of the things that we looked at as we left office was the fact that there's a lot of disabled people in this country that actually want to work, are precluded from doing so because of very basic, unbelievably basic things that are just stopping them from working or incentivizing employers from hiring them, and that's just wrong morally, but it's wrong economically too. And then, as I said, the other aspect is around younger workers, and the fact that we've got 13% youth unemployed is not right. It's one of the reasons we had a big push on apprenticeships, and we created, I think, helped create about 500,000 apprenticeships, but we had things like the apprenticeship levy, which didn't really work as well as they should have done. And so I think now is a time to reflect on that. But if you can tackle long-term sickness and if you can tackle youth unemployment, mindful of the changes in technology and energy development and all this kind of stuff, you can really grow the economy and improve our productivity. That's our challenge.
Your other areas of employment, though, were successful, if you look at the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, they were. I mean, look, under a Conservative government, we created an environment where 800 jobs were created a day by businesses. If you look at the geographic distribution of those jobs, it improved under our, you know, so it wasn't all bad.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's why I said at the beginning, you know, we do have a tendency in this country to be quite gloomy and modest, if I'm being kind. But on employment, we did have a good record. We are near record lows of unemployment, but without, you know, not without its challenges.
You never get thanked for the things that
No,
go
you
well.
don't. No, it's fine.
No.
Yeah.
Time for one more question. Just the woman at the front. Yeah.
Thank you. So I actually want to touch on workforce and long-term sickness. So I'm Carol Yench. I'm a patient representative of the Osteoporosis Society Better Bones campaign for Universal Fracture Liaison Services. Fracture Liaison Services diagnose people with osteoporosis early and get them onto medication, preventing further disabling fractures. So there are roughly 80,000 fractures a year for workforce, so work-aged people. So that's one of the reasons that they're being forced, obviously, into claiming benefits or unemployment generally. So diagnosing them early makes sense to them, obviously, the public purse and the economy. Prevention services like this will break even after only 2 years. How can we ensure that the new Treasury team takes a holistic view to the benefits that fracture liaison services can bring?
Yeah, I mean, I can go again if you wish. We absolutely need to reform healthcare in this country, for sure, and have that difficult conversation. Keir Starmer said the Labour Party is the only party that can do that. By that he means market reforms, which, again, going back to it, where it is appropriate, where it works, we should support that. I don't believe it's Labour only who can implement those policies. But one of the things that I think we can point to, that we started and we should have gone further and the next shadow team should pursue rigorously is a focus on prevention. If you think about the mindset in our country is that when I'm sick, I go to a GP, or when I'm sick, I go to a hospital. But actually, we've rolled out these community diagnostic centres around the country. We've empowered pharmacies to do far more to take away it's that kind of model that can be incredibly beneficial. Grantham was one of the first places to get a CDC. They're pumping out 70,000 tests now every year. That's an incredible burden lifted from our traditional outlets for healthcare. And you know what? If they identify issues early on, that will save the taxpayer, it'll save the public purse longer. But we need to sort of turbocharge that and really think about all the different ways in which we can roll that out and stop talking about just hospitals or just the GP surgery. There's so much more to it. Having a holistic, total approach to healthcare prevention is the answer, I'm convinced, but it's not my area, that's for others to come up with more detailed policies on, but I'm absolutely convinced that is how we fix this problem.
Okay. Sounds good.
That's all we have time for, so please join me in thanking our panel. And we've got 2 more events today, so please feel free to stick around or enjoy the rest of your day.